Thanks for coming along tonight, folks, on this rather cool evening in Sydney, where Andrew Bragg makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. He's been here quite a few times, and he's a hard worker with a lot of things to say, and so we're very happy to have him back. And thanks to Mike Zorbas, one of our board members, who suggested that we should have him here. So thanks for that, Mike. So I'll introduce Senator Bragg briefly, a senator for New South Wales since 2019 and currently the Shadow Minister for Productivity and Deregulation, Housing and Homelessness. And his topic tonight is Turning Around the Titanic, the Coalition's plan to solve Australia's red tape emergency. Senator Bragg, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much, Jared. And can I thank you and thank Anne for this wonderful institution, the nation's best clearinghouse. And this is the third time I've had an opportunity to speak at the Sydney Institute, once on Indigenous recognition, another time on housing. So thank you very much to Jared and Anne. So tonight I'm talking to you about the red tape emergency facing our country. And as you know, we are an ambitious people. We want to get ahead, build things, create jobs, and leave our children a better future. But our prosperity is now under threat. Growth is flatlining and productivity is collapsing. As an opposition, we will be constructive where we can and critical where we must. Under this government, hard-working Australians are facing a double whammy. They're working longer, earning less, and Australian businesses are sinking into a cost and regulatory quagmire. The long-standing dream of owning a house is similarly falling out of reach. So now is the time for us to face facts. Our once lucky country is actually in decline. We are now paying for past but somewhat recent failures. There are many reasons for this decline, but one of the main reasons is we've become inefficient, bureaucratic and unproductive. Tonight I will address the failures of Labor's first term, the dangers of their second, and the Coalition's plan to develop a red tape cutting agenda. We are experiencing negative productivity growth. That means living standards are going backwards. Over-regulation is driving a misallocation of resources and driving down productivity. The Albanese Government introduced 5,034 regulations in just 3 years. In addition to these 5,000 new rules, 400 new laws were enacted last Parliament. Labor's re-regulation has crushed entrepreneurship and innovation. But this goes beyond just embedding the Fair Work Commission, thank you very much, and unions into business transactions, or the creation of monolithic funds like the Reconstruction, Housing and Rewiring the Nation organisations. Albanese's Labor has introduced bad and retrograde laws like the ridiculously strict country-by-country tax reporting. This new regime goes well beyond comparable jurisdictions like the EU. It exceeds OECD standards and will introduce a $30 million compliance cost. Another example is giving the Reserve Bank 2 boards. Then there is the pointless legislation of defining the purpose of superannuation, which is unenforceable and pointless. Labor is so focused on new regulations, they regulated lunch in Canberra. If you can believe it, the new National Portrait Gallery of Australia regulations officially restrict patrons from bringing in outside food and drinks. Tonight I can reveal that the total cost of complying with the new laws from the Albanese's first term is $4.8 billion. That is a total conservative cost of the government's own impact analysis from the Prime Minister's department. That's $4.8 billion that could have gone into new capital equipment, new staff, better training or investing in technology. Instead it's being eaten by red tape. The Audit Office said back in 2014 that the total annual cost of all Australian government regulation was about $65 billion per annum, or almost 5% of GDP. Since 2014, almost 1,500 new laws have passed Parliament. So therefore, we must now be closer to 10% of GDP being eaten up by compliance. In fact, last week's BCA report exposed the sad truth. Australia now has a $110 billion red tape burden. We can't afford these indulgences. The Parliamentary Library reports that over the past 5 years, total private sector investment has been $1.3 trillion, whereas government consumption was $2.7 trillion. Put simply, the government is crowding out the private economy and suffocating it. Around 80% of all employment growth in the last 2 years in Australia has been in the non-market sector, despite it accounting for just 30% of total employment. The non-market sector jobs are those which are government funded or government supported. The majority of new jobs under this government are people working for the government. The massive expansion of the non-market sector has also damaged productivity. Since Labor came to office, it's down by 5%, and it's not getting better. Last week, the RBA downgraded it from 1% to just 0.7%. The warning lights are flashing. The big expansion of the non-market sector alongside the new regulations is cooking the productivity and cooking the economy. Labor now say they want the private economy to lead our revival, but their actions betray their words. I contend that Australia's current approach to regulation is no longer fit for purpose. This has become a cultural problem. The COVID pandemic revealed that we are not as relaxed as we imagine ourselves to be. As a nation, we should not be afraid of accepting manageable risks to boost our output. As I said in my first speech back in 2019, we support enterprise, we believe in markets, and we believe in some regulation of industry. Central planning and fixing in the age of the internet is laughable and should remind this House of the folly of indulging trade union demands to re-regulate our economy. Many regulations are well-intentioned, but we must now confront their cumulative effect. If we fail to chart a new course, we will continue drifting down the world league tables. This year, Australia has fallen 5 places in the IMD World Competitiveness Rankings and now ranks 37th for business efficiency. Similarly, the OECD report that we have a higher regulatory burden than the average economy. New research from the Parliamentary Library tells a story of a nation obsessed with rules and regulations. The total number of acts in force in Australia is 1,241. In New Zealand, it's 1,057. In Canada, 880. Canada has almost double the population, but we have 35% more laws. We're comparatively over-codified. Take Singapore. Its total competition law is 200 pages. Our corporations law is 4,000 pages and runs across multiple volumes. If Chapter 7 of the Corps Act was its own act, it would be the 10th longest act of Parliament. So while Singapore's model is principles-based and business-facing, ours is prescriptive, process-heavy and legalistic. We have 5 definitions of small business in federal law. This might suit the needs of lobbyists and lawyers, but it's killing investment, enterprise and jobs. The problem is we have too many rules and they are damaging our productivity and our competitive position. So what can be done about this wicked and sometimes boring problem? The answer is deregulation. Deregulation is not about removing all rules, it's about making sure they work for people, not against them. It's about backing Australians to take risk, accept greater responsibility and create a better future. But deregulation is not new, but sadly almost all prior endeavours failed. Why is this? I would say that there are 7 reasons. The failure to prevent the growth in new regulation or the flow, the absence of a methodology to drive meaningful sustained red tape reduction or the stock, a lack of focus on law enforcement of existing rules, distractions which eliminated redundant rules but made no material benefit, the failure of the Prime Minister and his department to perform its role of impact analysis, Canberra's commitment to vested interests, where maintaining a suite of regulation suits a particular incumbent, like a trade union, and finally, an increased reliance on delegated legislation, which is lazy, cheap, and undemocratic. The default response of this government to a problem is to add more regulation, even if it is duplicative or similar to another rule. More rules is always seen as good. The minister announced the problem is solved, the caravan moves on, the dog barks. there is limited interest in how the new laws are enforced, unless there is a scandal. Some efforts to reduce red tape have been cruelled by a widely held perception that one man's red tape is another man's consumer protection. This is a very damaging proposition because it assumes that every single rule in the book must be retained to save someone from something. But that's not true, because in many cases the law enforcement doesn't exist. So the country is paying twice. We pay the red tape burden cost, and we pay for no law enforcement. For example, we now have a compensation scheme of last resort. But what we really need is the enforcement of the multitude of corporate and financial laws that we have. A Senate inquiry documented the failures of ASIC, but we have no response from the government after 13 months. They're supposed to respond in 3. Now we have the First Guardian, Shield and Lion financial collapses, and Australians are rightly asking themselves, why weren't the rules enforced to protect their investments? Labor hasn't even bothered to issue ASIC with a statement of expectations. The last one was issued by Treasurer Frydenberg in 2018. In 2023, the Law Reform Commission recommended a massive consolidation of corporations and financial services laws. They found that one bank spent $1 billion, Dr. Evil, $1 billion on compliance. The ALRC report has been ignored by Labor. We have a serious problem with law enforcement. You can walk over the Harbour Bridge calling for the death of Jews and there's no law enforcement. You can steal people's money and send it to the Cayman Islands, no law enforcement. You can breach copyright laws and take people's creative work for AI, there's no law enforcement. So a new approach to reboot Australian enterprise is desperately needed. But we can only do this if we have a genuine debate about the role of regulation and its limits. We need a new methodology to permanently reduce red tape, which must be more than just 1 or 2 repeal days. The federal office designed to analyse regulation is the Office of Impact Analysis. The OAI is the latest iteration of the original Business Regulation Review Unit established by the Hawke Government in 1985. This was later renamed the Office of Best Practice Regulation, and it sits inside the PMC. In 2014, the Abbott government decided that all federal government judgments on regulatory matters, which are more than minor, must have a RIS, or Regulatory Impact Statement. Those RISs include a cost estimation number, showing whether government judgments increase or reduce compliance costs. In November 2022, the Albanese Government renamed the OBPR the Office of Impact Analysis, and RISs were renamed Impact Analyses. Why Labor decided to take the word regulation out of the office is a mystery to me. Nevertheless, the OAI is meant to be the guardrail preventing unnecessary compliance costs, killing business. I can reveal that under this government, the OAI has seen its headcount cut from 21 to 16 in just 3 years. The OAI failed to stop any of the 400 new bills in Labor's first term, a 100% strike rate so far. The Productivity Commission is scathing in its latest report on the OAI under Labor. They gutted the OAI as they re-regulated the economy. It's a failure of the Prime Minister. This is his department. The PC recommended strengthening the independence of this body because it is a neutered dog under this government. Another reason we can't deregulate is because regulation suits rent seekers. One of the biggest problems of the last 3 years of Australia's economics policy is that it's been focused on vested interests, not the national interests. Labor has shoveled money and policy out the door to the people who ran and supported their campaign for office. One example is the abolition of the Building and Construction Commission for the CFMEU. This has been very bad for housing. In 2022, Ernst & Young modelled the abolition. They said there could be a cumulative $47 billion fall in GDP by 2030 if the ABCC was abolished, with a significant reduction in construction industry output. And that's what's happening. Similarly, rules underpinning the Federal Safety Commission seem more about trade unions clipping the ticket than they do about worker safety. And then we have the community benefit principles embedded in the Future Made in Australia policy, which locks Australia into the subsidisation of industry and bad ideas, which is exactly what the PC warned against, and it contains magical, never-ending payments to unions. The latest example is the one we've already seen from tomorrow's Productivity Roundtable. Labor has now pushed ASIC to help the super funds to buy up domestic housing. That is not the Australian dream. It also diverts ASIC's resources from law enforcement. But in Labor's world of rent seeking, this all makes sense. Former Macquarie banker Ivan Power has described this rent seeker's paradise as Australian anemia. Australia maintains rules that reward rent seekers and vested interests. But what we really need are rules which reward enterprise and individuals. One reason the Albanese Government has introduced 5,034 new regulations in just one term is because they have inherited and created for themselves an incredible level of delegated authority. Generally speaking, this means ministers make disallowable regulations, or they issue an instrument which is not reviewable or disallowable by Parliament. In this way, the minister makes the law. The government is now breaching the boundaries of what is reasonable to delegate. And on many occasions, they have sought virtually unlimited delegated authority to make material judgments in regulation that is not delegated legislation. There are two examples of where this is happening now. Firstly, on the unrealised gains tax, the Treasurer will arm himself with the ability to set the pension tax arrangements for the Prime Minister after the bill passes the Senate. This is an unmanageable conflict of interest for the Treasurer to set the tax rules for his boss's pension. Surely all the relevant details of the parliamentary defined benefit scheme should be in the bill, given this howling conflict of interest. Secondly, the government wants to materially change the Commonwealth's mortgage insurance policy, the Home Guarantee Scheme. Labor wants to uncap the scheme and remove any restriction, thereby allowing a billionaire's child to get mortgage insurance from the Commonwealth. In other words, they will nationalise mortgage insurance for first home buyers, which is a material change to the scheme. This can all be done with regulation, and that regulation will not be disallowable by Parliament. I've sought assurance from the Minister, Claire O'Neill, there'll be some industry consultation, but that was secretive and only ran for a couple of weeks. A whole industry could be wiped out, which includes the insurers, but also the fintechs and innovative companies, which are solving the problem, I should say, of low or no deposits. But the delegations are so deep that none of this matters in Australia today. They can just do it. These skeleton or Henry VIII clauses are a complete perversion of the democratic process. And the Law Reform Commission and the Senate Committee on Delegated Legislation have both issued warnings. Over-delegation is one element of the Australian regulatory disease. It's all too easy to make more rules. So as we look to reboot Australian enterprise, we can look to the UK, US, and even the EU. UK Prime Minister Starmer has said deregulation is now essential for realising Labor ambitions. He's committed his government to a 25% cut in regulation. The US has its own program, and even the red tape-obsessed EU is putting us to shame. Mario Draghi has done a report on deregulation, and they are going to cut reporting obligations and duplication. Your move, Australia. Australian Labor seems to have discovered the impact of its regulatory burden after winning this year's election. Tomorrow's roundtable was a surprising announcement, especially given their first term was dedicated to increasing red tape. At the Press Club in June, the Treasurer said he would write to the regulators seeking specific measurable actions to reduce compliance costs without compromising standards. So far, that hasn't worked. Small businesses describe regulators acting as if they are on their backs and they're on steroids. They feel that they are always under pressure from regulators. So this hasn't worked so far. We welcome Labor's sudden devotion to cutting red tape, and we will help them turn around the Titanic. But that's how significant the challenge is going to be. The irony of the red tape obsession is it's undermined Labor's ability to pursue its own policies. And this failure is most apparent when you look at housing. It seems that the Treasurer and the Housing Minister have read the book called Abundance, It's incredible that they had to read a book written by an American about American conditions to discover the disease they've inflicted on Australians. Surely they knew that there was only one credible way to deal with the housing crisis, and that was supply. But after 3 years, Labor has failed on housing supply. Under the Coalition, 200,000 houses were built a year on average. That has fallen to 170,000 houses a year under average. Labor has failed to pressure the states. They've allowed the states to indulge in NIMBYism, and NIMBYism is an absolute cancer. It is totally unacceptable. They've failed to use their massive federal platform for YIMBYism, which is ultimately going to be needed to build the houses that we need. The failure on the supply side is now hurting the society itself. And as Australians, we have so much to be proud of. We've achieved so much in this past 250 years. The first land grants were issued by Arthur Phillip in 1792, and by the end of the Menzies era, home ownership peaked at 70%. This was a supreme democratic achievement of Australian liberalism. But today that achievement is under enormous pressure. And that's why we need stronger federal measures on housing, if we are to return to the dream that younger people aspire to. But it must be a supply-side endeavour, as most demand-side measures make the problem worse. Labor went to the election in 2022 promising to build 1.2 million new houses. Their housing accord. The truth is, they won't build even 1 million new houses. No state or territory is projected to meet their share. Last term, we discovered that Labor's signature housing policy, the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, has built 0 new houses. Instead, this money was spent acquiring existing houses, therefore making the problem worse. Today, Labor is doubling down on their big government approach. They will expand the home guarantee scheme so it's not means-tested and totally uncapped. And they'll spend $10 billion to build 100,000 new houses. Labor plans to become a government property developer and mortgage insurer. So instead of examining the bottlenecks containing private builders, Labor is usurping them. In June this year, Claire O'Neill announced the Commonwealth is back in the hard work of building housing. But the Commonwealth shouldn't be building houses. It should be asking what are the regulations which are causing builders, tradies and plumbers to go out of business. This includes the measures that Labor introduced in their first term, which have added to the burden. I've met with stakeholders in the housing sectors and construction sectors that describe insane conditions. No concrete pours after 10 a.m. Stop work triggers for inclement weather. And limits of work hour. These are all things that raise the cost of construction and push the first home out of reach. For the construction industry, suppliers are locked out of big projects if they don't pay into the specified union-linked redundancy funds. Looking at one of these big funds, Protect, its board looks like a big super fund. 5 of the 7 directors come from the ETU or the National Electrical and Consumers Association, and in 2024, Protect gave $7.5 million in fees to unions marked as disbursements and sponsorship. We've seen this film before. This is what happens when you put vested interests first. So Labor can't have it both ways. They can't claim to be supporting the construction of new houses when their freshly inked regulations make it harder and harder to build new houses. So the Labor Party want to see big government and big vested interests, clearly. We want big opportunity. We're the party of enterprise, and we remain the party of small, medium and large business. We believe in Australia and its people. And as Menzies said in 1944, governments do not provide enterprise, they provide controls. Accordingly, our deregulation policy will reflect this timeless position. We will promote genuine enterprise with limited rather than repressive controls. And that's why Susan Lee has created my portfolio of productivity and deregulation. This is now a priority for the entire coalition team through a whole of government approach. Under Susan Lee, we will reconnect with business. As part of our deregulation agenda, we are identifying the key areas which will make the biggest impact to our economy. Over the past 3 months, I've been engaging widely and I look forward to doing more so. Each proposal to cut red tape must be accompanied by a rigorous costing as we seek to relieve this burden. Identifying all areas will take time, but we've already identified a few. Housing is one. There may be room to go further than our prior policy to freeze the National Construction Code, which the government said during the campaign was a bad idea. They now say it's a good idea. If there's a lever to make houses more plentiful, we'll look at it. In financial services, we need to make sure that sound financial advice is accessible. But overly prescriptive education requirements have seen the numbers of financial advisors shrink from 28,000 in 2018 to just 15,000 today. What's more, mining and resources remain the lifeblood of our economy. It stands to reason then that government should be working hard with these sectors to boost our international position and competitiveness, rather than smothering them in red and green tape. But multi-employer bargaining, forced bargaining, and union rights of entry, expansion rights, are all examples of Labor's new rules which damage that position. Allowing industries to raise consumer standards without government hand-holding is also a good idea. This nation has a long tradition of self-regulation. The first example was the New South Wales Medical Board in 1838. Frankly, in many cases, industry and professional bodies have a better understanding of the guardrails needed than the politicians. There's also the budgetary advantage to self-regulation. Industry pays, not the taxpayer. So effective self-regulation exists across the board today. The Banking Association maintain a code where there are enforceable standards for dealing with hardship support and dispute resolution. I have personal experience developing the Life Insurance Code of Conduct, which has transformed transparency and reporting now available to policyholders. For example, retail death claims have made a 63% timetable improvement from 3.5 months to 1.3 months, all achieved without legislation. So over the coming 3 years, we'll be looking actively to support avenues for self-regulation as well. It's not always desirable, but it should be an option. So I'm the first shadow minister or minister to have the word deregulation in over a decade. This is a long time coming for Australia, but very important. And together with my colleagues, we're committed to cutting red tape to boost enterprise, investment and jobs. This is just the beginning. Thank you.
So many thanks to Senator Bragg for an important address. So we come to questions and discussion. Can I just take you back to Parliament? I remember when Julia Gillard's government was analysed, and some commentators said it was the most successful government ever because it had passed more legislation. Now, is there a problem with the structure of Parliament House? I mean, you've got a whole lot of bureaucrats devoted to writing legislation. You've got people who organise the Parliament having to have legislation around or regulation around for politicians to comment on to fill in gaps. I mean, are you sort of forced into that? I mean, how do you get out of that sort of mindset that more legislation is basically good and it's what politicians do all the time?
Well, I don't think it's an easy problem to solve because, as we've seen just in the last few months, I mean, now the government's proposing to ban YouTube for under 16s. I mean, I think, again, that's going to be totally unenforceable and quite ridiculous. I mean, there's also the philosophical question here, but there's an industry based around the growth of regulation, which is going to be very hard to unpick. So unless you've got a methodology to roll some out as you roll them in, then I don't think you're going to make any headway. And frankly, no government in the last decade has even tried to do it. So that's why if you look at the chart that we've produced, which looks at the last 10 years, what you saw in 14-15 was a net reduction in the number of regulations overall in terms of the cost. So it's not a reduction in the number of regulations in terms of volume, but the cost of those regulations as measured by the central agency. So that's really the best you can hope for, because there's always going to be some new regulations. But can you relieve the economy of the cost of the really expensive ones? So that's really where we've got to get to. And it's going to be a challenging debate because there's a huge amount of vested interest saying you've got to maintain the existing suite, all thousands and thousands of regulations, because they've built their jobs around them.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah. Minister, thank you. Regardless of the legitimacy of your message, which is pretty legitimate, how does the coalition propose to, in a not simplistic, but as a understandable way as possible, get that across to the voting public?
Yeah. So it's quite simple, and it's basically that the red tape burden is making it harder for you to take a risk, expand your business, pursue your dream, because it's a heavy burden that you're paying for. And we have to have a more reasonable debate about what regulation can actually achieve for people. And I think that's why I talk about some of the examples where there's no law enforcement, because I think what has shocked me maybe the most since the election actually has been reading the letters that have come to me from constituents who have lost their life savings in these Shield, First Guardian and Lion collapses, which you may have read about in the papers. And one of them particularly is stuck in my mind, that this person described their personal circumstances, and they're clearly quite articulate, quite clever people, quite a clever person in this case. And he says, well, I thought that Australia was a proper country, a serious country where if I do all the right things and I invest properly in accordance with the rules, I'll be protected. But it seems like I won't be protected at all. And I think, frankly, we need to be upfront with people that just because you have a law doesn't mean it's going to be enforced. So there's a few parts to it. I think the main point is that we cannot maintain the current burden of regulation in our economy because it is killing productivity and killing opportunity. Then there is a separate conversation to be had about the quality of law enforcement, which is an entirely different thing. But it's all part of that issue, I think. It's quite heavily linked.
Thanks for the talk. The problem at the moment could be also that the media beats up and beats on private enterprise, you know, and there's an awful lot of that bagging of private enterprise. Then you come across those incidents where people lose their money. Is it more that the reason the population has moved slightly left, or very much left, is because they're looking to government for protection and they don't trust the market anymore? How much is this a problem for getting deregulation?
I think it's a huge problem, and I think that's why we've got to talk about these values of law enforcement across the board, because, I mean, even if people support the idea that YouTube should be banned for under 16s, I mean, how do people imagine that might be enforced inside the family home? I mean, I'm sure that a smart kid might just log on to their parents' YouTube or Google account. I mean, I think it's going to take a more sophisticated conversation than we've had over the past few years, where there's an assumption that every new announcement by a minister for a new rule is good, firstly, and secondly, the assumption that all those rules are going to be magically enforced. So I think that's where we've got to get to. The community has to accept that the current suite of regulations and laws in this country are not being enforced anyway. So we should be more circumspect about the rules that we want to have, and those rules should be targeted, clear and focused, principles-based, and then there's a separate conversation to be had about the quality of the law enforcement that we have in this country. I mean, I have strong views about some of these agencies, but there are some agencies that do very good law enforcement. But ultimately, I think it's about having a clearer idea, and frankly, the parliamentarians that preside over these very extensive laws, as I said in the address, 1,200 laws compared to 880 in Canada. I mean, we are accountable for these laws, so we should be able to justify why these are all required and why it's so bloody complex.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. I obviously have answered questions put by you in the committee system when I was at ASIC. I do tend to agree with much of what you have said. I just was interested in your views as to the following things happening. First of all, to break up the Corporations Act so that it is specific to particular industries. The most obviously dissonant aspect of the Corporations Act is between markets and financial services, in which the participants participate quite differently. Secondly, couple that with taking away law enforcement from all agencies, perhaps not the ATO, because that's really about debt recovery. That was talked about by the Royal Commissioner and was talked about by the Treasurer, and that's been reported. Therefore, having something akin to the CDPP, which is the Commonwealth Prosecutor, but for civil penalties. Therefore, ACCC and ASIC don't have the power to make those decisions and effectively shrunk to supervisory agencies with much, as you said, targeted legislative oversight?
Well, the answer to the first question is that I think that the ALRC's report on Consolidated and Corporations Act is a very good concept. It's been sitting on a desk in Canberra for almost 2 years now, and I think that we should definitely consider that as part of our own policy-making framework, because we need to have that same honest conversation with the Australian people about the quality of law enforcement is probably in part driven by the quality of the legislation and how simple and clear it is. On the second issue of, whether you separate these things out, I mean, it's a longer policy question. I did do a Senate report into ASIC and did make recommendations about its structure. That report has also gone unanswered by the Treasurer. I mean, the Treasurer is very good at his little quips at different people in the media, but he doesn't seem to have time to get around to issuing the agency, in this case, even with a statement of expectations. So, but he's been able to get them to divert resources away from law enforcement so they can help the super funds buy more houses. So it seems that some pieces of paper do make his desk.
Thank you, Senator. Do you have an indicative deregulation target? And if that target is achieved, how should the impact on small business, innovation and job growth be tracked and reported back to us?
It's a very good question. As I say, the last Parliament, the new laws passed amount to about $5 billion in new red tape compliance costs. So we would want to roll back at least that with our target. I think that would be a reasonable starting point, because then you'd at least be back to where we were before Labor came into power in 2022. I do think that the increased red tape burden has hurt productivity. I don't see how you can argue that re-regulating the labour market hasn't damaged productivity. I think that's clearly what the Productivity Commission is saying. I think Danielle Wood is doing a very good job as a public servant to make all these points. In fact, her presentations today are very clear that the regulatory burden is out of control in Australia. So Andrew Lee, who's the junior minister to Chalmers, is out there saying, well, it's not about counting regulations in terms of the volume of numbers. That's not important. But what is important is the cost of those regulations. So, as I say, 5,000 new regulations in the last Parliament, 400 new laws, but those 400 new laws cost almost $5 billion. We're not even sure of the total cost of the regulations. But the answer to your question is, we want to at least roll back the bad news of the last 3 years, but we want to be ambitious. I mean, I think we want to do better than that, but that would be at least a starting point. This will be subject to debate with colleagues. I mean, I'll go around and talk to all my colleagues in the Shadow Cabinet about identifying opportunities in their portfolios for red tape reduction. Now, some of them have already identified some quite exciting opportunities, and others are still on that journey. But I look forward to going on that journey with them.
Senator, thanks for your presentation tonight. You mentioned anti-competitive regulation. Much of the regulation that impacts on business comes about because one group of business people say, protect me from my competitor. And when they talk about regulation and deregulation and the removal of red tape, they want to take away all that red tape that they don't like, but they want to keep those bits that protect them. How do you overcome those vested interests?
Well, it's very simple. I mean, your job is to represent the people. You're not there to represent vested interests. And I think there's going to be cavalcade of rent seekers in Canberra, whether you like it or not, right? They're going to be there chocking up the cafes at Parliament House, and that's part of the system. But you've got to see it for what it is, and you've got to be prepared to have a few fights. I mean, I think if you're not having a few fights in politics, then I wonder why you're wanting to do the job. Because I genuinely think we have a problem with state capture. I think, without being too conspiratorial, I mean, we have a lot of business models that are totally based around now the state. So you've got compulsory super, you've got the childcare model where effectively you've got to force people to put all their money into a particular savings vehicle. You've got to put all your money, if you want to get access to the child care subsidy, into a particular form of childcare. I mean, then you've got the NDIS and other things. So you're living in a country where there is a lot of that. So if you want to change anything, I'll give you I know the super industry well. So I mean, that is the world's largest conga line of vested interests, because you've got the effectively you've got the advisors, the insurers, you've got the asset managers, the asset consultants, you've got all the marketing, all the media that hangs off it. I mean, these guys literally, they open the door and the money falls in. So it allows them to buy a lot of people. So they have huge power. So anytime you talk about changing that, you know, they say, oh, the sky's going to fall in. Sorry, it's a long answer. The answer is you've got to be prepared to have a few fights. And from my point of view, that's all good.
You've had a few fights with ASIC, I think, is that right?
Well, I mean, I just think that they haven't been effective at law enforcement. And I can't believe that we did this huge report saying that they'd been hopeless and recommending all these things. I mean, one of the recommendations was that ASIC should establish a proper complaints handling function. So basically, if you have discovered a corporate crime in Australia, you're better off reporting it to the media, because that way you get some action. If you report it to ASIC, they'll lose a piece of paper, because we found that people were making complaints to ASIC and the piece of paper was being lost, or the dog was eating the piece of paper. And then effectively the situation was that all these people lost their life savings. People committed suicide. I mean, it's horrendous if you lose all your money. And this is a cycle that the nation's on. So we do this report 13 months ago and we say, well, look, recommendation one is that if you get a complaint from someone about something that's happened, you've got to say, thank you, we've received your complaint. This is what we're going to do, to the extent that we can tell you. Okay, that was, I thought, pretty reasonable. We also had a recommendation that if they received a complaint from the industry, someone of standing, they had to respond quickly. Anyway, now what we've discovered is with these First Guardian, Shield and Lion collapses, is that they received warnings about two of them 11 or 12 months before they took serious regulatory action. And in that time, these people were fleeced, lost their life savings. Some people have committed suicide. So my point is that, yes, I think they are hopeless. And I'm disappointed that the government hasn't refashioned them, because, frankly, this is now on them. I mean, law enforcement is their only job. They seem to be able to do everything else but law enforcement.
Thank you very much for your time tonight, Senator. This has been very informative. My question's around housing supply. So we know there's an issue across the country with the supply on quality housing, driven by invented supply side constraints in the form of zoning, environmental approvals and slow council-led planning pathways across Australia. What's the coalition's position on whether build to rent, which is kind of gaining momentum across the country, on whether that provides a pathway to secure homes for those currently priced out? Yeah,
so no problem with build to rent. No problem with build to rent, but I don't think it needs a tax cut. So the government have legislation in the parliament. They've passed through parliament actually to give build to rent a tax cut. That would go to foreign asset managers. We think it's a bad idea. We want people to own houses, not foreign asset managers. I don't think BlackRock needs to own more houses. I don't think Cbus needs to own more houses. I don't think that the super funds, I think it's culturally jarring, the idea that we're going to have super funds become Australia's landlords. I mean, what kind of a country is this going to be? So I think it's an ugly idea that it gets a tax cut. If people want to build it, build it. But you don't need a tax cut from Canberra.
Hi, Senator. You mentioned disallowance, and I was just noting that there was only one regulation disallowed in the last term Parliament. And as someone who tried and failed to get a regulation disallowed in the last term Parliament, I noted that that was actually less than the average over the pre-COVID years. But could you just talk a little bit more about sort of potentially as a political strategy what the opposition may do in terms of using disallowance over this term, and related to that, the question of government actually coming forward with regulation that's actually outside of its legislative powers, kind of what options have you got for actually, tackling that head on?
It's a good question. So I think the Greens is the answer to both, because the way the Senate is comprised, we need the Greens to vote with us on a disallowance. So if it's about an integrity or a transparency issue, there is a chance the Greens might vote with us. If it's about other things, then less likely. So I think it really depends on the Greens and what sort of role they want to play. If they want to only play nice with the government, then it's going to be a pretty boring parliament because we won't be able to do anything. So there's no other configuration of numbers in the Senate that's going to allow us to disallow anything. So the first disallowance that we'll vote on will actually be the build to rent disallowance. And I mean, the Greens historically, I mean, Chandler Mather, who was the Greens housing spokesman, he actually was against build to rent. His view was that we shouldn't be giving foreign fund managers a tax cut, which I happen to agree with, and so does the Liberal Party. But I think he was overruled by the Mr. Band, who's no longer with us. And then I'm not sure what the new person's view is on this, but it's one to watch. But generally speaking, unless you get the Greens, then there'll be no disallowance in this parliament. The good news is that in the last parliament, what the government tried to do was to give the RBA unlimited power to set payments regulation. Now, I know payments is almost as boring as red tape, but let me say to you that I think the regulation of payment systems is going to be one of the most important areas of economic policy going forward, because a payment system could a payment system could disrupt your whole economy overnight, effectively. And the government's plan is to give the RBA, who no one voted for, lovely people down here at Martin Place, the ability to set the payments regulations and for those to be not disallowable. And so we had an agreement between myself and the Greens that we would force the government to amend that bill to make those instruments disallowable. Now, that bill has just been reintroduced into the House to give the RBA these powers. And so we'll be working on the Greens to make sure that they hold to that commitment. I'm actually sure that they will. So on some things, I think the Greens will be reasonable, but on others, I'm sure that they won't be.
Thanks for your speech tonight. Just interested to hear more about your thoughts around the use of AI as a tool to help simplify a lot of these laws, like basically throwing the Corporations Act into an AI tool to simplify it right down. I think the chairman of ASIC is on the record to say that he would be reluctant, or it would be a great leap of faith for ASIC to be doing that. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts about regulators more generally using that, and just very briefly also any thoughts about how AI should be regulated. Do you think there's enough rules right now to cover privacy and all these other aspects, or does it need its own standalone laws?
Well, I'm so glad that ASIC has so much time to make all these political statements about the policy and laws that we should have in Australia. I mean, it sounds like they should be running for Parliament. You know, they can run through their pre-selections and everything, and we'll see what happens. But it's great they've got time to do that. It's really great. I mean, I just wish they would enforce the law. I mean, I really don't care what they think about AI. I just want them to do the job. I don't know what we need to do to get them to do their jobs, but that's what we need to happen. So on the issue of whether AI can consolidate laws, I mean, of course it can. And I think that's something that Parliament should seriously consider doing. On what Australia should do, we should make sure that our copyright laws don't inhibit AI. That's quite separate from making sure people are properly paid. But we've got to make sure that we don't become a backwater from a copyright point of view. We've got to make sure that we improve our competitive position so we can have some of these data centres in this country. Even if we imagine that the microchips and the chips are going to become more and more powerful, the data centres are still going to be an important part of the ecosystem. So I still think we want to have that. And I don't see any other role for further regulation. I mean, unless there is some enormous risk which emerges. Because geopolitically, this is a race between China and the US as to who can develop the applications. We're not going to be developing the applications. I mean, there is one quite successful application in Australia, which you know about. But we're not going to be Silicon Valley or Shenzhen here. And that's okay. But we've got to make sure that our small businesses are able to adapt and use the technology. And I think that if we look at stupid regulations, then I think we'll damage our own competitive position. And that's why I say, I use the YouTube under-16s ban just as an example. Because I think it makes us look very unfriendly to what's coming. I mean, this is going to come whether we like it or not. It's going to disrupt. It's going to take some jobs. It's going to create some jobs. Now, I used to be an auditor. It's going to create a massive auditing industry. It's going to create the data center industry. It's going to impact other jobs in a negative fashion. but it's coming, whether we like it or not. So I think we've got to be very careful, because if I was a Martian from outer space and I looked at Australia over the last few years and I saw 5,000 new regulations, 400 bills which costs the country $5 billion, a ban on YouTube, I'd be thinking, well, these guys are going to regulate the buggery out of AI.
I've got a Zoom call from David in Canberra, and he asked, is the coalition looking at a US-style approach to legislation? For example, one regulation imposed, 10 should be removed.
We're not going to take any pages out of the Doge book, no. That's dead, buried and cremated. But certainly we will be looking to do it our way. And yes, there is a piece around volume, but it's really the piece is around the cost, the regulatory cost. So that's why I say in my remarks tonight, we're looking for, we're open for business. We're looking for unsolicited proposals, but we want to identify the biggest cost savings from regulatory removal. And I know that it's going to be housing, mining, financial services, corporate law more generally as a starting point. So that's where we'll zero in. And there won't be repeal days or any of those things. It'll be much more focused on what are the big chunky things that are costed out, they're going to make the biggest single difference. I mean, even if we won government tomorrow and we removed some of the crazy IR stuff and we got rid of Future Made in Australia and a few other things, that would have a huge immediate benefit to Australia as a destination to invest.
Senator, you've given us the most wonderful list of examples of the long march through the institutions. The thing I'm worried about is the fact that more than 50% of the Australian population now is on a government benefit. You're talking about an old-fashioned pull yourself up by your own bootstraps ideal. How do you overcome the extraordinary willingness of people to be suckled as they are on the federal and state teats?
Well, because of the disruptive forces that are coming for us. We're not going to be able to just sail on as a lucky country forever because of AI and the other technology factors that are going to disrupt. So the fact is that there is a big cost of having a highly regulated economy that is driving investment and jobs offshore. We're seeing it. And so that is the conversation we have to have. So the link is that, and I know it may sound a bit academic, but the link is that the high level of regulation is damaging our productivity and damaging our opportunities. And it's unsustainable. And that's the message. That's what we'll be saying. And it may take some time, but we're at the bottom of the mountain politically. And so this is the best time for us to do the proper thinking and to do the work and to get this framework right. And Susan is very keen that all the shadows identify opportunities to do this work, and it'll be an important part of our shadow economic process. So we'll all talk about it. So Ted will talk about it, Patterson will talk about it, Wilson will talk about it. So it'll be part of our shtick.
That's a good way to finish. And I think so. Many thanks.
Thanks.
So thanks to Senator Bragg for an important talk tonight. He's a very hard worker and always has something to say and can get a message across. So well done again tonight.